It is a stunning artifact, a whisper from the deep past. Found on the coast of Virginia, this sliver of stone, a bifacial spear point, was dated to the height of the last ice age. But it posed an impossible question. It should not have been there. For decades, the story of the first peoples was considered settled. They came from Asia, crossing the great land bridge of Beringia, and moved south, populating 2 continents. It remains one of the greatest stories of human migration. But what if it wasn't the only story? What if the first footfalls on this new world did not come from the west, but from the east? Not across the Pacific, but across the frozen Atlantic. This is the foundation of the Solutrean hypothesis. A claim so radical, it attempts to rewrite the prehistory of an entire hemisphere. It proposes that the first indigenous Americans were Europeans. To understand this claim, one must travel back 22,000 years, not to America, but to Ice Age France and Spain. This was the world of the Solutrean people. They were a culture of the Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens surviving at the edge of the great ice sheets. They were hunter-gatherers, living in a brutal, frozen landscape overshadowed by glaciers. And yet, from this harsh existence, they produced an artistic and technological legacy that baffled archaeologists. Their cave paintings are famous, but their true genius was carved in stone. The Solutrean people were, perhaps, the finest stone tool makers of the entire Stone Age. Their signature creation, the laurel leaf point. These were not crude tools. They were masterpieces. Some, thin as a blade and over a foot long, were clearly ceremonial. But the functional points were objects of lethal, streamlined beauty. Historians and archaeologists have long debated how they achieved this. The Solutrean masters employed a revolutionary technique. Not just striking, but pressure flaking. The why of this technique is a lesson in physics. Instead of just hammering one rock against another, they would use a pointed tool of antler or bone. They would press this tool against the edge of the flint with immense, controlled force. This static pressure would push a small, thin flake off the stone, allowing for a level of precision and thinness that percussion simply cannot achieve. The result was a tool that was lighter, stronger, and far sharper. It was the pinnacle of Stone Age ballistic engineering. This technology was their signature. It was unique to them. It appeared, flourished, and then vanished with them around 17,000 years ago. For a century, this was just a fact of European prehistory until the 1990s. When archaeologists Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, experts in stone tools, began looking at collections from the American East Coast, they saw tools found in Maryland and Virginia that predated the famous Clovis culture. And to their eyes, these American tools looked undeniably Solutrean. The flaking patterns, the distinctive outrepassé or overshot flaking, the sheer thinness of the biface. The similarities were, in their view, too specific to be a coincidence. Suddenly, the discovery in Virginia was no longer an anomaly. It was Exhibit A in a radical new case. The greatest mystery of American archaeology was suddenly reopened. Had a small band of Ice Age hunters, armed with these elegant stone weapons, navigated the 3,000-mile edge of the North Atlantic ice sheet? Did they discover an empty continent? The implications were staggering, and the battle lines were drawn. A theory this explosive cannot rest on a single, out-of-place artifact. The proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis knew they needed more. They needed to connect their Ice Age Europeans to the most famous, and for a long time, the oldest, culture of indigenous Americans, the Clovis people. For most of the 20th century, Clovis was the baseline. First discovered in New Mexico, their distinctive spear points were found from coast to coast. They were the mark of a highly mobile, successful people who hunted mammoth and mastodon. The Clovis first model became archaeological dogma. These were, without question, the first Americans, and their technology was their calling card. The Clovis point is a marvel of engineering. It is a bifacial, fluted point. That flute, a long, distinctive channel chipped away from the base, is a work of genius. The why of this design is still debated by historians, but most agree it was a shock absorber and a hafting mechanism. It allowed the point to be securely fastened to a spear shaft, creating a socket that was both strong and flexible, able to withstand the violent impact of a hunt. It was this very technology that the hypothesis proponents, Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford, seized upon. They argued that the only way to create the refined Clovis point was to first master the techniques of the Solutrean laurel leaf. That one technology was the direct ancestor of the other. Their argument was not just about the shape, it was about the process, the how. To create these thin, symmetrical bifaces, both cultures allegedly used a technique known as overshot flaking. This is not a technique for beginners. It is high risk, high reward. The why of overshot flaking is a matter of pure, leveraged force. The flint napper must strike the edge of the stone with such precision and power that the resulting flake travels all the way across the face and removes the other edge as well. It is incredibly efficient. A single strike thins the entire point, but it is also incredibly dangerous. A fraction too much force, or the wrong angle, and the entire piece shatters. It is a method that requires immense confidence and years of practice. According to the hypothesis, only Solutrean and Clovis era makers mastered this technique. To its proponents, this was the smoking gun. A shared, complex, and non-intuitive mental template. But a question immediately arises, one that echoes through all of science. Is this a case of connection or convergence? Convergent evolution is when two separate species in two different parts of the world independently evolve the same solution to the same problem. The eye of an octopus and the eye of a human. The wings of a bat and the wings of a bird. Could the same be true of technology? Is it not possible that two different groups of human hunters, separated by an ocean, both faced the same challenge? How to create a thin, lethal stone point, and, through trial and error, arrived at the same brilliant, high-risk solution. The entire weight of the Solutrean-Clovis link rests on this one technical similarity, a compelling visual match, a shared, complex method. But critics pointed out that while the process looked similar, the final products were different. The Solutrean points had no flute. The Clovis points were not shaped like laurel leaves. Was this connection a revolutionary insight? Or was it simply the case of two master craftsmen, worlds apart, solving the same lethal problem? The search for an answer would force scientists to look beyond the stones and into the one place the past cannot hide, the cold, hard logic of time. The case for a connection, built on the shared mastery of stone, seemed compelling. But in forensic science, a suspect's alibi is critical. In archaeology, that alibi is the timeline. And when scientists laid the timelines of these two cultures side by side, the Solutrean hypothesis encountered its first crippling obstacle, a 4,000-year gap. In Europe, the Solutrean culture, with its magnificent laurel leaf points, flourished and then peaked. By 17,000 years before present, it vanishes from the archaeological record. It was not just a decline, it was a replacement. In the same caves and shelters of France and Spain, a new and different culture, the Magdalenian, takes over. The Magdalenian people were themselves innovators, but their genius was in a different domain. They mastered the carving of bone and antler, creating the first-eyed needles and intricate barbed harpoons for hunting reindeer and fish. Historians still debate the cause of this transition, but the archaeological fact is undisputed. The unique Solutrean stoneworking technology, the pressure-flaked biface, disappears. The signature is gone. In North America, the Clovis culture appears, but it does not appear until 13,500 years before present. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is a chasm in time, 4,000 years long. A period longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire, from its mythical founding to its final collapse. The why of this gap is the central problem. The hypothesis requires a belief in a scenario that has no parallel in human history. We must believe that a group of Solutreans crossed the Atlantic, and then, for 4 millennia, their descendants lived on a new continent, leaving zero archaeological trace. No bones, no failed tools, no campsites. And, most implausibly,
Here we see the Anzic I
we must
burial.
believe they
The
froze
infant
their
skeleton is
technology,
surrounded by these distinctive
that they
fluted
preserved the
Clovis
exact same complex manufacturing process, the mental template, for over 200 generations, only to have it suddenly re-emerge, fully formed, as Clovis. Technology simply does not behave this way. It adapts, it changes, or it is lost. For decades, proponents of the hypothesis tried to find pre-Clovis sites that bridged this 4,000-year gap. And in a stunning turn of events, they found them. The discovery, however, did not help the Solutrean hypothesis. It destroyed it. The old Clovis first model is now dead. At the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho, archaeologists unearthed tools and animal bones dated to over 16,000 years old. At the Buttermilk Creek complex in Texas, evidence pushed human occupation back to 15,500 years. And then, the definitive, indisputable proof. In White Sands National Park, New Mexico, scientists discovered something that cannot be misdated or misinterpreted. Not tools, but footprints. Thousands of human footprints pressed into the ancient mud of a lakeside. The tracks of adults, adolescents, and children. Using carbon dating on the plant seeds embedded within these tracks, the age was confirmed, between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. This discovery changed everything. It means people were in North America long before the Clovis culture. It means people were in North America during the peak of the Solutrean culture in Europe. It means people were in North America before the last glacial maximum, the very ice age that was supposed to have created the ice bridge to cross.
The pointer follows the path.
The empty continent was a myth.
Between the Laurentide
The first
and
Americans were
Cordilleran
already
ice
here.
sheets.
The stones had told one story. The timeline had told another. But the final, decisive answer would come not from the Earth, but from within us. The investigation moved from archaeology to genetics. The stones could be debated. The timelines could be reinterpreted. But the revolution in ancient DNA sequencing promised a final, decisive answer. For the first time, science could look past the ambiguous artifacts and read the genetic history written into the bones of the first peoples themselves. Initially, proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis pointed to a tantalizing clue, a genetic marker known as Haplogroup X. The why of this argument is a lesson in genetics. A haplogroup is a broad genetic family, a deep ancestral branch passed down through the maternal line. Most indigenous Americans belong to 4 main haplogroups, A, B, C, and D. All of them are definitively Asian in origin. But a fifth, minor haplogroup was also found, X. This discovery was shocking. Haplogroup X was common in Europe and the Middle East, but virtually absent from East Asia. To the hypothesis proponents, this was the genetic bridge. Here, finally, was a direct biological link between ancient Europe and Native America. But as genetic sequencing became more precise, that bridge collapsed. Scientists began to analyze not just the main branch, X, but its smaller twigs or subclades. The results were unambiguous. The Native American lineage was a specific branch called X2A. The European lineage was a different branch, X2B. They were related, but only distantly. They were like two cousins who shared a common ancestor many generations back. And when geneticists tracked that common ancestor, they found that person had lived, not in France or Spain, but in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, over 30,000 years ago. The story of Haplogroup X was not one of an Atlantic crossing. It was the story of a great divergence in Central Asia. One group of descendants, X2B, traveled west into Europe. Another group, X2A, traveled east, joining the Great Migration across Beringia. The supposed genetic proof for the hypothesis had, in fact, become the strongest proof against it. But the final, conclusive blow was still to come. In 1968, on a ranch in Montana, a set of human remains were found. They were the bones of a 1-year-old child, buried over 12,600 years ago. And with him were over 100 classic Clovis tools coated in sacred red ochre. This was Anzic I, the only known human burial from the Clovis culture. For decades, the remains were a source of pain and controversy between scientists and local tribes. But in 2014, in a landmark collaboration, the child's entire genome was sequenced. This was the moment of truth. If the Solutrean hypothesis were true, if Clovis technology was a European import, this child's DNA would show the link. It showed the precise opposite. The Anzic I genome had zero connection to Paleolithic Europe. His DNA was unequivocally Siberian in origin. He was more closely related to all modern Native Americans, from the Ojibwe in the north to the Maya in the south, than any other people on Earth. The scientific community now had its answer. The debate was over. Geneticists, archaeologists, and anthropologists all reached a consensus. The ghost in the genome had spoken. The people who made the Clovis tools were not a lost band of European hunters. They were the direct ancestors of the indigenous peoples who live today. With the Atlantic crossing definitively disproven, science turned its full attention back to the origin point that the data had demanded all along: Asia. The genetic and archaeological evidence, from the 23,000-year-old footprints at White Sands, to the 16,000-year-old tools at Cooper's Ferry, to the Siberian DNA in the Anzic child, all point in one unified direction. The journey to the Americas was not a desperate, hypothetical drift across a frozen ocean. It was a multi-generational odyssey over land. This land was Beringia. Today, it is a frigid, shallow sea. But during the Ice Age, it was a different world. The why of its existence is a matter of simple hydraulics. So much of the Earth's water was locked up in continental ice sheets, a mile high, that global sea levels plummeted by over 4 feet. The land connecting Siberia and Alaska was not a narrow bridge. It was a vast, unglaciated subcontinent. A windswept, treeless plain of steppe tundra, 1,000 miles wide. This was not a place to be crossed in a single generation. It was a place to be lived in. Genetic evidence supports this. A theory known as the Beringian standstill shows that the ancestors of all Native Americans paused in this homeland for thousands of years. They were a population isolated from their Siberian ancestors and not yet able to move into the Americas. What blocked their path? A wall of ice. Two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, covered all of modern-day Canada. They were an impassable, frozen desert. For decades, the greatest question in American archaeology was, how did they get south? The long-held theory was the ice-free corridor. This hypothesis proposed that, as the climate warmed, a narrow, 1,000-mile-long gap opened between the two great ice sheets, allowing passage. For generations, this was taught as fact, but the theory had a fatal flaw. Geologists now argue whether this corridor was even open in time. And even if it was, newer environmental data suggests it was a sterile, desolate landscape, incapable of supporting human life until after people were already established in the South. The people at White Sands and Cooper's Ferry were already in America before this supposed gateway was even unlocked. This has forced a new consensus, a theory that is both older and more logical. The coastal migration, the Kelp Highway. The why of this route is based on resources. While the inland was frozen, the Pacific coast may have been a viable refuge. Using small boats, people could have hopscotched down the shoreline from island to island, in a way of life familiar to coastal hunters. This was not a barren shore. It was a rich, linear ecosystem. Vast kelp forests would have provided a reliable source of food: fish, shellfish, seabirds, and sea mammals, all the way from Beringia down to California. Historians and archaeologists still debate this vigorously. The greatest challenge for the Kelp Highway hypothesis is the lack of hard evidence. If these first Americans were coastal people, their camps and settlements are now lost to us, submerged under 400 feet of water as the glaciers melted and the seas rose. What remains are the footprints, the stone tools, and the genes. And they all tell the same story. The real epic was not an Atlantic fantasy. It was a Beringian reality, a story of resilience, adaptation, and survival over millennia, against the crushing power of the Ice Age, on a journey from one world to the next. The scientific consensus is clear. The Solutrean hypothesis, as a theory for the peopling of the Americas, is dead. The stones, the timeline, and the genes all tell the same unambiguous story. The first indigenous Americans came from Asia. Their ancestors were the people of the Beringian homeland. Their journey was one of the most profound epics of human history. This leaves one final, lingering question. Why does the Solutrean myth persist? Why does a theory, so thoroughly and completely debunked by every available line of scientific evidence, continue to find life on the internet, in books, and in documentaries? The answer, perhaps, is that the hypothesis was never just about the science. It was about the story. It is a compelling narrative, a tale of heroic, familiar-looking heroes battling a frozen sea. It takes a known quantity, Ice Age Europeans, and inserts them into the origin story of a different continent. But this narrative, while romantic, has a dark and troubled edge. Since its inception, the Solutrean hypothesis has been co-opted by non-scientific groups for a very specific modern political purpose. It has become a tool for those who wish to sow doubt, to challenge the identity and the historical primacy of modern indigenous peoples. The why of this appropriation is transparent. If Europeans were also indigenous, it attempts to morally level the historical playing field. It subtly, and sometimes explicitly, seeks to provide a justification for later colonization, recasting it as a reclaiming of a lost heritage. It is a narrative that attempts to write white people into a history where they do not belong, thereby undermining the unique status of those who do. This is why the scientific truth matters. The rejection of the Solutrean hypothesis is not just an academic footnote. It is a critical defense of the factual past against a weaponized, ideological fiction. Science has shown us that the real story of the first peoples is far more complex and far more incredible. It is a story of a 23,000-year-old footprint pressed into New Mexico mud. A story of a child in Montana whose genes bind him to every indigenous nation on 2 continents. A story of a multi-millennial pause in a lost land, Beringia, and a perilous journey down a coastline now lost to the sea. The past is a foreign country, and we must be careful not to fill its empty spaces with our own reflections. The ultimate value of this investigation is not simply to answer who was first. It is to demonstrate how we know the truth. The truth is not found in a single, tantalizing spear point that looks right. It is found in the painstaking, objective, and overwhelming consensus of genetics, geology, and archaeology. The evidence confirms that the deep history of the Americas, a story of resilience and ingenuity against all odds, belongs to the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of today, not to a lost tribe of European hunters. And the tools of science, not wishful thinking, are what allow us to honor that truth.